Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on one long, uninterrupted, deeply peaceful journey through the life of Catherine Howard, a young girl who rose from poverty and near complete obscurity to become the Queen of England, only to lose everything before she had barely begun to live. This is not a short story. It is a full and complete one, told from its very beginning to its very end, softly and carefully, the way all important stories deserve to be told. Catherine Howard was many things to many people during her brief time in this world. To her king, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His rose without a thorn, the late blessing of a life that had already consumed 4 marriages and 2 executions, and more grief than most people encounter in a lifetime. To her uncle and her powerful family, she was a political instrument, a pawn placed on the board of Tudor court politics at the moment when the game demanded exactly the peace she represented. To the court that surrounded her, she was a dazzling and somewhat puzzling young queen, warm, generous, genuine in her kindness, but young in ways that no amount of fine dressing or jeweled crowns could entirely disguise. And to history, she has been, for most of the centuries since her death, a cautionary tale, a girl who made bad choices and paid for them, a footnote in the larger drama of Henry VIII's reign, a minor figure who flared briefly and went out. But Catherine Howard was more than any of these things. She was a real person with a real history, one that began not in the grandeur of palaces, but in the quiet struggle of a noble family that had too many children, too little money, and too little capacity for protecting the most vulnerable among them. Her story is one of neglect and exploitation, of extraordinary elevation and equally extraordinary abandonment, of a young woman placed in the most dangerous position in England without the preparation, the protection, or the genuine support that she needed and never received. It is a story about what happens to people who are used as instruments by those with power over them. And it is a story that, when told with the care it deserves, demands something more from us than judgment. It demands understanding. We will move through her life tonight from beginning to end. Her difficult childhood, the years in her step-grandmother's household where the dangers no one warned her about were already gathering, the extraordinary and terrifying months when she was the most admired woman in England, the private complications that were quietly building toward explosion, even as the public spectacle of her queenship shone at its brightest, and finally the long cold winter of her imprisonment, and the February morning when a teenage girl laid her head upon a block at the Tower of London and left this world with more dignity than the world had ever extended to her. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber tonight, please take just a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about whichever part of Catherine's story moved you most deeply, and subscribe to Sleepy Crown so that these soothing historical tales keep finding their way to you. We have a wonderful family of dreamers here, and we are always glad to welcome someone new into our circle. So cozy up now, dear listener. Pull your blanket a little closer, let your breathing slow, and let these soft whispers from Tudor England carry you gently toward rest. If you are new here tonight, welcome. We are so glad you found us. Now let us begin. Catherine, later known as Queen Catherine Howard, 5th wife of King Henry VIII of England, was born into a world that did not particularly expect her to matter. She arrived sometime around the year 1523, most likely in the district of Lambeth in London, to parents whose circumstances were precarious at best and steadily deteriorating at worst. No one recorded the exact date of her birth. No one thought it necessary. She was simply another child in a household already full of children, born to a family already burdened by debt and disappointment, entering a world that had no particular plan for her and no particular resources to offer her, even if it had. This absence of a recorded birth date is one of the small but telling details of Catherine Howard's life, and it is worth pausing on for just a moment before we move forward. Here was a girl who would one day be proclaimed Queen of England in the grandest palace in the land, who would receive jewels and furs and properties from a besotted king who could not give her enough, who would be addressed by ambassadors and attended by ladies and celebrated at Christmas banquets as the most fortunate young woman in the kingdom. And yet the day she came into the world was not considered worth writing down. She was not expected in those first days of her life to matter at all. This is where her story begins, not with expectation, but with its absence, not with grandeur, but with the quiet, ordinary difficulty of a family in trouble. Her father was Lord Edmund Howard, the third son of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, one of the most powerful and distinguished noble families in England, a dynasty that had served the crown for generations and had accumulated through that service a reputation, a title, and a network of connections that placed the Howard name among the highest in the land. The Duke of Norfolk was a man of enormous influence in the early Tudor period, a soldier and statesman whose importance to the crown was reflected in every aspect of his household and his social position. His sons would inherit different portions of this legacy, according to the strict rules of primogeniture that governed the transmission of noble titles and estates in Tudor England, rules that gave everything of real substance to the eldest son, and left the younger sons to manage as best they could on the strength of the family name and whatever modest provisions their father arranged for them. Edmund Howard was the third son. He inherited the name without the means. He inherited the expectations without the resources to fulfill them. And he proved, across the decades of his adult life, entirely unable to close the gap between what his birth and his pride demanded and what his circumstances could actually provide. He was a man of poor judgment in financial matters, inclined toward the kind of spending that looked appropriate to a man of his lineage, but that was catastrophically inappropriate to a man of his actual means. He gambled, he borrowed, he accumulated debts at a rate that eventually made ordinary life in London genuinely dangerous for him. Not in any dramatic physical sense, but in the legal and social sense of a man whose creditors had the right and the inclination to have him arrested and imprisoned for non-payment of his obligations. The desperation that defined Edmund Howard's financial life comes through with painful clarity in a letter he wrote to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey in the year 1527. In this letter he described himself as so far in danger of the king's laws by reason of debt that he dared not go abroad or come to his own house, and was forced to absent himself from his wife and his poor children. He begged Wolsey to intercede on his behalf, to use whatever influence he had with the king to help Edgar out of the impossible situation he had created for himself. The letter is full of the particular anguish of a proud man reduced to begging, a man who knew perfectly well what his family's name was supposed to mean, and who found himself utterly unable to live up to it, who was hiding from his creditors and unable to come home to his children, and who was spelling all of this out in writing to a churchman whose origins were far less distinguished than his own. Catherine's mother was Joyce Culpeper Howard, a woman who had been married once before she became Edmund's wife. From her first marriage to a man named Ralph Lee, Joyce had brought approximately 5 children into the new household, and she and Edmund then proceeded to have 6 more children together, making Catherine roughly the 10th child in this blended and very crowded domestic arrangement. The sheer number of people competing for the household's limited resources gives some indication of the atmosphere in which Catherine grew up, a world of perpetual insufficiency, of never quite enough of anything. where the basic necessities of life were managed and stretched and worried over in ways that must have been a constant background noise to everyone who lived within those walls. And then, when Catherine was approximately 5 years old, Joyce died. The exact cause of her death in 1528 is not recorded in any surviving document. What is recorded, in the ripple effects that her absence sent through the family, is the immediate consequence of losing the one parent who had been present and capable of providing whatever stability existed in the household. Edmund, already struggling, was now also bereaved, managing a house full of children on his own, still pursued by his creditors, still unable to return freely to his own home, still caught in the endless deterioration of a life built on foundations that were never adequate to what was demanded of them. Edmund remarried, as widowers with children generally did in the 16th century, when practical necessity made remarriage almost unavoidable. And then he married again after that. Neither subsequent wife appears to have developed a particularly warm or engaged relationship with the children of his earlier marriages. Catherine, lost somewhere in the middle of a very large household, moving through the years of her earliest childhood, without a mother and with a father whose attention was perpetually absorbed by his financial catastrophes and his legal difficulties, grew up without the consistent, attentive, genuinely protective parental presence that every child needs, and that she in particular needed very much. What we can infer about the emotional climate of Catherine's earliest childhood comes partly from what the historical record tells us about the family's circumstances, and partly from what the later evidence of her personality and her behavior suggests about how those circumstances shaped her. The girl who would later charm an entire royal court with her warmth and her laughter and her genuine ease with people had to have developed those qualities somewhere, and they did not develop in a vacuum. People who grow up in difficult and unstable households often develop exactly the kind of social radar that Catherine seems to have had, an acute sensitivity to the moods and needs of those around them, a capacity for making themselves agreeable and likable as a form of self-protection, a warmth that is partly natural temperament and partly a skill learned in an environment where pleasing others was one of the few strategies reliably available to you. She was, by all later accounts, genuinely vivacious, genuinely warm, not merely performing warmth. She loved music with a passion that appears to have been entirely authentic, responding to it with her whole self, rather than with the careful, controlled appreciation of someone treating music as an accomplishment. She loved dancing with equal intensity, the kind of full-bodied enjoyment that made her a welcome presence on any dance floor, and that communicated something genuinely joyful about her relationship with music and movement. These were real qualities, real pleasures, real aspects of a personality that had genuine substance, and they developed in the years of a childhood that gave them very little encouragement and very few resources. The family's situation reached a kind of formal resolution in 1531, when Edmund Howard was appointed Comptroller of Calais, the English-controlled territory across the Channel. Through the intercession of connections, his family's name and his daughter-in-law's influence could still access. The appointment required him to leave England, and the move provided both a form of relief from the immediate press of his domestic debts and a practical reason to disperse the household. Several of the older children were placed in appropriate marriages. The younger ones required other arrangements, and Catherine, who was approximately 8 years old in 1531, was sent to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The Dowager Duchess was a formidable woman by anyone's measurement. She was the widow of the great second Duke of Norfolk himself, which placed her at the very top tier of English noble society. She commanded 2 substantial households, Chesworth House in Horsham, Sussex, and Norfolk House in Lambeth, and she was accustomed to taking in wards from the poorer branches of the extended Howard family and related connections, providing them with a home and a basic education and training in the customs and expectations of aristocratic life. This was considered entirely normal and appropriate in Tudor England. A great lady's household was expected to serve this function, absorbing the children of less fortunate relatives and preparing them for the roles they would eventually be called upon to play in the world. Edmund Howard almost certainly believed that in sending Catherine to the Duchess, he was making the best possible provision for his daughter. He was placing her in a distinguished household, removing her from the instability of his own situation, and giving her access to training and social connections that he himself could not provide. Whether he thought carefully about what the Duchess's household was actually like on a daily basis, whether he asked whether Catherine would be actively watched over, specifically protected, genuinely guided through the vulnerabilities of adolescence, is not something the historical record tells us. Most likely, he did not ask these questions, because in the world he lived in, they were not the questions one generally asked when placing a child in a great household. You placed the child, you trusted the household, you returned to your own pressing affairs. Edmund Howard was dismissed from his post in Calais in 1539, and he died that same year in March. He never saw his daughter become Queen of England. He never saw the extraordinary and terrible trajectory that the child he had sent away to the Duchess's household would travel in the years after his death. He died as he had lived, in modest circumstances, leaving very little behind him. A man whose principal legacy to history was a daughter he had never adequately cared for, and whose fate he never lived to know. Catherine arrived at Chesworth House in Horsham in approximately 1531, 8 years old, carrying whatever small stock of possessions she had. Entering a world entirely new to her, she settled into the Duchess's household with the adaptability that was already becoming one of her defining characteristics, and she began the years that would shape everything that came after. Chesworth House in Horsham, Sussex, was a large and comfortable country estate, a house of genuine substance, set in the green and gently rolling landscape of the Sussex countryside, surrounded by gardens and grounds, maintained in the manner appropriate to a residence of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. The house itself was old, as many country houses were old, accumulated and adapted over generations to serve the needs of whoever occupied it at any given time, full of the particular atmospheric density that old houses develop when they have been lived in continuously for long enough. In the autumn of 1531, when Catherine Howard arrived there as a ward of the Duchess, it would have smelled of wood smoke and cooking and the particular cold freshness of the Sussex countryside, and it would have been full of people, the wards and young attendants and household staff, who made up the daily community of a great noblewoman's establishment in Tudor England. The Dowager Duchess Agnes Howard was not a villain. This is one of the first things that needs to be said clearly about the woman who was Catherine's guardian during the years that shaped her so decisively, because the temptation to cast her as a deliberate agent of Catherine's ruin is one that the facts do not entirely support. She was a woman of genuine social prominence, who had responsibilities that extended in many directions simultaneously, who maintained 2 large households, who attended court regularly, who managed the complex affairs of a wealthy and well-connected widowhood in an era when such management required constant attention to business and social obligation. She was not present in her own households in any continuous or consistent way. She depended on the established routines of her household to manage things in her absence, and those routines were adequate for most purposes, but not for all purposes, and specifically not for the purpose of actively protecting the young women in her care from the particular dangers that gathered in a poorly supervised dormitory when the lady of the house was elsewhere. The communal sleeping and living space known as the Maiden's Chamber was the center of social life for the young female wards and attendants in the Duchess's household. It was a dormitory, a shared room where a group of young women slept in the same space, kept their possessions, spent their leisure hours, formed friendships and intimacies, learned the customs and the gossip of household life together. Communal sleeping arrangements of this kind were entirely normal in Tudor England, across a wide range of social levels. Private bedrooms were the privilege of the very wealthy and the very senior, and even in great households, the majority of residents slept in shared spaces, moving through the rhythms of shared domestic life with the ease that comes from having known nothing else. The problem with the Maiden's Chamber in the Duchess's household was not that it was communal, but that it was insufficiently controlled. Young men who had no business being in the women's dormitory were able to come and go with a regularity and an ease that should have been impossible in a properly supervised household. Attendants, secretaries, general household staff, they arrived in the evenings after the Duchess had retired or was absent from home, and they socialized with the young women who lived there with a freedom that gradually normalized what should never have been normalized. The senior household members who were theoretically responsible for maintaining order were either unaware of what was happening, or were aware and chose not to intervene, or were themselves part of the loose culture that had developed in the Duchess's absence and that had long since settled into routine. For Catherine, arriving as an 8-year-old in this environment, the early years passed in the ordinary rhythms of childhood as it was lived in such a household. She received her lessons, reading, some writing, the music that she loved above everything else, and that the household provided instruction in as a matter of standard accomplishment for young women of her class. She formed friendships with the other girls who shared her world. She danced when there was dancing, which was frequently enough to feed her natural pleasure in it. She made herself agreeable to those around her with the ease and warmth that were already defining characteristics of her personality. She was, by any account that touches on this period, a happy enough child, or at least a child who had developed a very effective presentation of happiness, which in practical terms served the same social functions. She grew. The years passed at Chesworth and at Norfolk House in Lambeth, the Duchess's town residence on the south bank of the Thames, and Catherine moved between them as the household moved, carrying herself and her things from one to the other with the adaptability of someone who had never known a single stable home and who had long since made peace with the fact that her world would always be in motion. She grew into a girl, and then into a young adolescent, and the Maiden's Chamber grew with her, became, as she aged, a more complex social world than it had been when she was 8, a world that included not just the friendships and the music and the dancing, but the more complicated dynamics that develop when young women and young men are in proximity without adequate supervision. It was at Horsham, sometime in the year 1536, when Catherine was approximately 12 or 13 years old, that Henry Mannix appeared in her life and in her story in a way that would never entirely leave either of them. Mannix had been engaged by the household to provide music instruction, specifically to teach Catherine the lute and the virginal, the two keyboard and string instruments that were considered essential accomplishments for young women of her social class, skills that would be assessed and admired in the social settings she would eventually navigate as an adult. As her music teacher, he held a specific and formally defined position of authority over her. He was the adult professional entrusted with her instruction, the person whose directions she was expected to follow, the figure in the learning relationship who possessed the knowledge and the skill that the student was there to acquire. The power differential was structural, built into the formal arrangement from its beginning, and it placed Catherine in a position of fundamental vulnerability relative to this man that had nothing to do with her particular personality or with his particular one. What Mannix did with this position of authority is described in Catherine's own words, words she gave during the investigation that would eventually destroy her life, words extracted under conditions of considerable duress by officials of the Crown who had every reason to interpret everything she said in the worst possible light. She said that at the flattering and fair persuasions of Mannix, being but a young girl, she suffered him at sundry times to handle and touch the secret parts of her body, and that this was conduct which neither became her with honesty to permit, nor him to require. These words, spoken by a frightened young woman fighting for her life in a formal royal investigation, deserve to be read with the attention they merit. She describes herself as a young girl, emphasizing her youth, the disproportion between her age and experience and his. She uses the word suffered, not enjoyed, not chosen, not agreed to, but suffered, a word that in 16th century English carried connotations of endurance and allowance rather than active assent. She acknowledges her own participation while simultaneously framing it as something that happened to her as a result of his persuasion, rather than something she initiated or pursued. And she notes that the conduct was neither honest for her to permit, nor appropriate for him to require, placing the moral responsibility squarely on his demand, rather than her response to it. The Dowager Duchess eventually found out that Mannix and Catherine had been meeting alone. How she found out is uncertain from the evidence, though later testimony suggests it may have been through a note sent by someone in the household who had observed what was happening. What is known is that the Duchess's response was to descend on the situation in fury and to strike Catherine, to strike the child who had been under her care and protection and who had been exploited by an adult man placed in authority over her by that same household. The anger was directed at Catherine. The full weight of adult displeasure fell on the person who had been least powerful in the dynamic being punished. Mannix was not removed from the household. The structural conditions that had allowed what happened to happen, the lack of supervision, the accessibility of the dormitory to men who should not have been there, the absence of any adult who was actively watching over the young women in the household, were not changed. The situation was declared addressed by the act of confrontation and punishment, and the Duchess returned to her own affairs, satisfied that the matter had been dealt with. For Catherine, the message delivered by this episode was both immediate and lasting. The adults who were supposed to protect her had not protected her. When what was done to her came to light, she was the one who was punished. The lesson, absorbed at 12 or 13 with the completeness that children absorb lessons that carry emotional weight, was that she was responsible for managing her own safety in a world where no one could really be counted on to manage it for her, that adults in positions of authority might do things to her that were wrong, that when those things came to light, she would be the one who paid the price for them, that composure and agreeableness were more reliable protections than any official guardian's care. These were devastating lessons for a child to learn. They were also, given the realities of her situation, entirely accurate. The household moved between Horsham and Lambeth, as it always did, and Catherine moved with it. Mannix followed the household to Lambeth, demonstrating a persistence that speaks to the nature of his interest in Catherine more clearly than any other evidence. He was still there, still in the orbit of the girl he had exploited, when the next significant figure in her story arrived. His name was Francis Dereham, and he was something entirely different from Mannix. or at least he presented himself as something entirely different. And Catherine, who had never been given the framework to evaluate these situations clearly, could not easily see where the genuine difference ended and the sameness of the underlying dynamic began. Francis Dereham was a gentleman pensioner in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a young man of moderate social standing and considerable personal confidence, educated enough to hold a position of some responsibility in a great household, assured enough in his manner to move through the world with the ease of someone who had never had serious reason to doubt that the world would accommodate him. He was, by the evidence of what survives about him, handsome and charming and persistent, possessed of the particular combination of qualities that makes a young man attractive to women and dangerous to young women who lack the protection and the experience to see past the charm to what lies beneath it. Dereham noticed Catherine Howard at the Lambeth household, and his noticing quickly became something more active. He pursued her with the single-mindedness of a man who had decided he wanted something, and who was accustomed to acquiring the things he wanted through persistence. The pursuit happened in the world of the maiden's chamber, in the evenings when the Duchess was absent or retired, in the half-supervised space that the Duchess's household had always been for its younger residents. He came to the dormitory at night, as other young men came, because the dormitory was accessible in ways it should not have been, and because no one in the household was actively enforcing the boundaries that should have been enforced. The relationship that developed between them was different from what had happened with Mannix, and Catherine appears to have experienced it as different, genuinely and meaningfully different in ways that mattered to her, even if the structural dynamic of power and dependency that surrounded it was not as different as it might have seemed. With Mannix, there had been only the exploitation of a child by an adult authority figure, a dynamic of pure imposition with nothing on Catherine's side but confusion and fear, and the gradual adjustment that children make to things they cannot escape. With Dereham, there was actual feeling, actual warmth, actual attachment, something that had the shape and the texture of a real relationship between two people who genuinely liked each other, even if the conditions in which that relationship existed made the full meaning of the word genuine complicated. She was approximately 15 when the relationship with Dereham became serious, and he was several years older. The exact gap unclear, as so many specific details about Catherine's life are unclear, but sufficient to place him firmly in a different category of experience and social power. She had grown up in his world for several years by this point, was a familiar part of the household landscape in which he moved, and had the vivacity and warmth that made her the kind of person that people were drawn to, regardless of what else was happening. He was drawn to her, and she, cautiously, with the wariness that the experience with Mannix had taught her, but also genuinely, responded. What made the Dereham relationship so consequential for everything that came after, so much more explosive in its eventual legal implications than anything that had preceded it, was the language and the ritual that accompanied it. The two of them began calling each other husband and wife. This was not merely an endearment, not merely the kind of playful romantic language that young people use to express the seriousness of their attachment. In the world of 16th century England, the exchange of vows of intention to marry, even informal ones spoken between two people in private without witnesses, without clergy, without any of the formal apparatus of a solemnized church marriage, could constitute what the law called a pre-contract, a form of informal but legally significant betrothal that the church treated as binding in ways that had real and serious implications for any subsequent marriage either party might attempt to make. A pre-contract was not a full marriage, but it was something that could, in the right circumstances, complicate or invalidate a later union. Whether Dereham and Catherine actually exchanged such vows, whether the husband and wife language they used was a genuine expression of a mutual intention to marry, or whether it was the romantic shorthand of a relationship that both of them understood, was unlikely to lead to a formal marriage given their respective positions, would become one of the central and most agonizing legal questions of Catherine's life several years later, in circumstances she could not have imagined in the evenings when she and Dereham sat together in the Lambeth dormitory and called each other by those loaded names. At the time, Catherine appears to have experienced the relationship primarily as a love affair, a serious one, marked by genuine feeling on both sides, but a love affair rather than a contract. She received the gifts Dereham gave her. She kept his money when he asked her to hold it for him, as a domestic partner might keep the household finances. She addressed him with the warmth and the openness that their intimacy warranted. She was, for this period of her life, genuinely attached to someone who appeared to be genuinely attached to her, and whatever complexity surrounded that attachment from the outside, from the inside, it must have felt like something real and valuable in a life that had not always provided her with either. The other women who shared the maiden's chamber knew exactly what was happening. The dormitory was a communal space in which privacy was largely a fiction, and the nighttime visits, the sounds, the evidence of an ongoing and serious intimate relationship were available to anyone present who was paying attention. Some of them, young women who had grown up in the same household, who had known Catherine for years, who had their own complicated relationships with the culture of the maiden's chamber, thought nothing particular of it. The behavior was not unusual enough in this household to attract special comment. It was simply part of the texture of life in a place where supervision was inadequate, and where young people had been making their own arrangements for years without serious consequence. The Dowager Duchess eventually discovered the relationship, again, through information provided by someone in the household, reportedly, in this instance, through a note sent by Henry Mannix, who had apparently been watching Dereham's progress with Catherine with the particular bitterness of someone who had been displaced from a position of intimacy he believed he still had some claim on. The Duchess descended on the situation with fury. She struck Catherine. She struck Dereham. She declared the relationship ended and ordered that they not be left alone together. And then she withdrew, satisfied once more that the situation had been addressed. But Dereham was already planning to go to Ireland. He had business there, opportunities there, reasons of his own that were drawing him away from the Duchess's household and across the Irish Sea toward a different chapter of his own story. When he left, sometime in the period following the Duchess's discovery of the relationship, probably in 1538 or 1539, he and Catherine parted with whatever understanding they had reached about what the relationship meant and what would happen to it in his absence. He left his money in her keeping. She kept it. He told the people around him, with the self-assurance of a man who believed his affairs were settled, that he had a special connection with the Queens, referring to Catherine, who at that point was of course nothing of the kind, but whose future elevation he could no more have predicted than anyone else. He went to Ireland believing that when he returned, the relationship would resume. He was wrong about this in a way that would prove catastrophic, not immediately, not obviously, but in the slow and devastating way that incorrect assumptions about other people's feelings tend to prove catastrophic when those people's circumstances have changed beyond recognition, and the person who made the assumption can neither accept the change nor find a way to adapt to it. While Dereham was in Ireland, the world around Catherine was changing in ways that made the life she had lived in the Duchess's household seem like something from a story about someone else entirely. Her uncle, Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, was making arrangements. He was watching the political landscape at the court of Henry VIII, with the sharp, calculating attention of a man who had survived decades of Tudor politics by knowing exactly when to move and what direction to move in. He saw opportunity. He had a young Howard woman available. He decided to act. Sometime in the year 1539, Catherine Howard left the Duchess's household and took up a position at the royal court of England as a lady-in-waiting to the king's new German wife, Anne of Cleves. She was, at most, 16 or 17 years old. She had spent her entire life in the Duchess's households. She had never seen a royal palace. She had no political experience, no formal preparation for court life, no genuine understanding of the world she was about to enter, or the extraordinary danger that world represented for any young woman who came too close to the center of its gravity. She was carrying her past with her, the relationship with Manox, the relationship with Dereham, the experiences in the Maiden's Chamber at Horsham and Lambeth that she desperately, instinctively needed to keep buried. And she was walking into a world where powerful people had extraordinary incentives to uncover exactly the kinds of things she most needed to keep hidden. She did not know this. She could not have known it. She was a girl from a country house dormitory, stepping into the most dangerous court in Europe. To understand what happened when Catherine Howard arrived at the court of Henry VIII, it is necessary to understand the man himself, not the golden king of his early reign, not the tall and magnificent athlete who had astonished Europe in the first years of his kingship, but the Henry of 1540, aging, enormous, in constant pain, and furious about his most recent marriage in ways that were colouring everything about the atmosphere of his court. Henry VIII was 48 years old when Catherine came to court, and those 48 years had produced a transformation in the man that was visible and undeniable to anyone who encountered him. The young Henry had been exceptional in almost every physical dimension. Over 6 feet tall, powerfully built, an extraordinary athlete who excelled at jousting and tennis and wrestling and hunting, who could outride and outrun most of the men around him, and who seemed to embody the vitality and vigor that his subjects expected from a king who ruled by divine right. He had been educated with unusual thoroughness for a monarch, intended for the church in his youth before his older brother Arthur's death had made him heir to the throne, and his education had given him facility in Latin, genuine knowledge of theology, real musical ability, and a breadth of intellectual engagement that made him unusual among contemporary rulers. He played the lute and the virginal. He composed songs. He debated theological questions with some of the finest minds in Europe. And he did all of this with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed ideas as well as physical accomplishment. The Henry of 1540 was the residue of all of this. The same man in many ways, in his appetites and his enthusiasms and his utter inability to accept contradiction or disappointment with anything like equanimity, but deposited in a body that had been comprehensively destroyed by 30 years of rich eating and limited exercise. He was enormous, by the estimates of those who described him carrying something close to 300 pounds on a frame that was still, beneath all of it, that of a tall and powerfully built man. He suffered from a chronic ulcerated wound on his left leg, a festering sore that had developed years earlier, possibly as the result of a jousting accident, possibly from other causes, and that had never properly healed, that required daily drainage and medical attention, that smelled profoundly unpleasant, and that caused him near constant pain of varying intensity. The pain from this wound darkened his moods in ways that were felt by everyone around him. The mood swings that had always been part of his temperament had become more extreme, more rapid, less predictable. The rages that had always been capable of turning a court gathering into a scene of terror could be triggered now by stimuli that might previously have been managed without incident. He had been married 3 times before he met Catherine Howard. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, had been the Spanish princess who had spent 20 years as his queen before Henry's determination to be rid of her. His desperate need for a legitimate male heir and his passionate desire for Anne Boleyn had led to the break with Rome and the annulment of the marriage. Catherine of Aragon had refused to accept the annulment with a courage and a dignity that had made her enormously popular with the English people, had fought through every legal avenue available to her, and had eventually died in January of 1536 in the cold and damp of a sequestered household, far from the court and far from her daughter, still insisting to her last that she was Henry's true and lawful wife. Anne Boleyn, the second wife, Catherine Howard's own cousin, had followed a trajectory that was in some ways a prefiguration of Catherine's own. She had captivated Henry for years, had managed the extraordinary political feat of holding him at a distance long enough to make herself his queen rather than merely his mistress, had given him a daughter in 1533, and had then been swept off her feet by the tide of Henry's changing favour and the political manoeuvring of Thomas Cromwell, who saw in her fall the opportunity to consolidate his own power. She had been accused of adultery and treason, charges that modern historians regard as almost certainly fabricated, and had been executed at the Tower of London in May of 1536. She was approximately 35 years old. She left behind a daughter who would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs, and a reputation that has been argued about and reassessed and refined by historians ever since. Jane Seymour, the third wife, had been everything that Henry appeared to want in a queen consort. Quiet, gentle, apparently compliant, possessed of the kind of soft-spoken manner that contrasted sharply with Anne Boleyn's sharpness, and made Henry feel perhaps that here at last was someone who would not challenge him or disappoint him or require management. Jane had given Henry what he had always most desperately wanted, a legitimate son. Prince Edward was born in October of 1537, and the bells rang across England and the bonfires burned, and Henry's relief and joy were genuine and total. Jane Seymour died 12 days after the birth from what was most likely childbed fever, an infection that was, in the 16th century, a common and frequently fatal complication of childbirth, and Henry mourned her with an authenticity and a duration that suggested this loss had struck him more deeply than the deaths of his previous wives, both of whom had died under circumstances in which his own agency was considerably implicated. By 1539, Henry had been a widower for 2 years. He had his heir, and the most immediate political pressures that had driven his previous marriages had somewhat eased. But political calculation never entirely ceased at the Tudor court, and Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, the man who had effectively managed the enormous practical business of the English Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, and the transformation of English governance over the previous decade, had determined that a new diplomatic marriage was in England's best strategic interest. He arranged, through careful diplomacy, a match with Anne of Cleves, the daughter of a German duke, whose Protestant affiliations made him a potentially valuable ally against the Catholic powers of Europe. Henry agreed, having reviewed a portrait of Anne painted by the court artist Hans Holbein, a portrait that apparently presented her in a sufficiently favourable light to satisfy the king's requirements. Anne arrived in England in late 1539 and early 1540. Henry travelled to meet her before the formal meeting arranged at Greenwich, arriving early and in disguise in the tradition of romantic royal behaviour, expecting to be delighted by what he found. He was not delighted. He was, by all accounts, profoundly and immediately disappointed. He found her physically unattractive in ways that the portrait had not prepared him for. He complained about her with a lack of restraint that was one of his less attractive characteristics, calling her, in the privacy of conversations with his counsellors, the Flanders mare, a description that was cruel and unfair, and entirely typical of Henry in the grip of disappointed expectations. The marriage proceeded anyway, because the diplomatic and legal machinery that had been set in motion could not easily be reversed, and because Anne herself, who was by all accounts a dignified and politically astute woman, handled the situation with a calm that was probably the most effective strategy available to her in the circumstances. But the marriage was a failure from its very beginning. It was never consummated. Henry avoided Anne's company whenever possible. He seethed at Cromwell for having placed him in this situation, and the atmosphere of the court in the spring of 1540 was saturated with the king's unhappiness in ways that everyone who moved through it could feel. It was into this atmosphere that Catherine Howard arrived, and Henry noticed her with an immediacy and an intensity that transformed the court's atmosphere almost overnight. The precise circumstances of their first significant encounter are not recorded with the specificity that historians might wish for. The most widely accepted version of events suggests that the Duke of Norfolk, watching, calculating, timing his move with the care of a very experienced political player, arranged the exposure carefully, most likely at a dinner or entertainment hosted at his own residence, where Catherine could be prominently visible to the king in circumstances that allowed Henry to pursue his interest without the immediate constraints of official ceremony. However it happened, the effect was rapid and unmistakable. Henry was captivated. He began to show it immediately, in the transparent way that very powerful people show their feelings when they have spent their lives in an environment where concealing them has rarely been necessary. The gifts arrived first. In April of 1540, Henry granted Catherine the lands of a convicted felon, a substantial material gift whose value was considerable and whose meaning was entirely clear to anyone at court who understood how royal favour was expressed. This was not the gift of a king to a lady he admired in a general social way. This was the gift of a man declaring his intentions in the language of material generosity that Tudor courtiers had learned to read with perfect precision. More gifts followed in May: expensive fabrics, furs of extraordinary quality, jewels of considerable value and beauty. The accumulation of these gifts told a story that required no words to interpret. The French ambassador Charles de Marillac, who was watching all of this with the professional attention of a man paid to observe exactly these developments, reported back to his king in Paris that Henry was so amorous of Catherine Howard that he could not treat her well enough, and was caressing her more openly and with less restraint than he had shown with any of his previous loves. The ambassador was scandalized, not by the age gap, which was unremarkable by 16th century standards, but by the sheer brazenness of the king's behaviour while he was still technically married to Anne of Cleves. A king pursuing another woman so openly while his current wife was still at court was a statement about how thoroughly Henry had stopped caring about the formal requirements of the situation. Anne of Cleves's last formal public appearance with Henry occurred at the May Day festivities of 1540. Shortly afterward, she was sent from court for her health officially, which fooled no one. The legal machinery of annulment was set in motion, and simultaneously the political machinery of Cromwell's destruction was accelerated by the Duke of Norfolk, who saw in the king's fury at Cromwell for having arranged this disastrous marriage the perfect moment to strike. On the 10th of June, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was arrested and taken to the Tower of London on charges of heresy and treason. He had been the most powerful man in England after the king for nearly a decade. He was gone in a morning, in the way that Tudor careers ended, suddenly, completely, without appeal. The annulment of the Cleves marriage was finalized on the 9th of July, 1540. Anne received her generous settlement and her title of the king's sister and her comfortable English life, and she accepted all of it with the equanimity of a woman who understood that gratitude for what she had been given was a more viable emotional response than grief for what was being taken away. 19 days after the annulment, on the 28th of July, 1540, Catherine Howard married King Henry VIII at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. It was a private ceremony, small and quiet, without the grand ceremonial apparatus that had attended Henry's earlier marriages. Henry was 50. Catherine was 16 or 17. The exact number uncertain, as so many things about her were uncertain. On the very same morning, on Tower Hill in London, Thomas Cromwell was led to the scaffold and executed. A wedding and an execution, on the same morning, in the same England, separated by a few miles of summer road. A new queen's life beginning on the day that a powerful man's ended. Some of the Howard family members who might have attended the wedding travelled instead to Tower Hill to watch Cromwell die, the satisfaction of seeing their great rival destroyed outweighing their obligation to celebrate their niece's elevation. Catherine Howard was Queen of England. She had barely lived 17 years. She had no preparation, no genuine allies, no protection from what was coming, and no understanding of the world she had just entered that was remotely adequate to its actual demands. She was, by the measure of what was about to be asked of her, almost entirely alone. The formal proclamation that made Catherine Howard's queenship official came 10 days after the wedding at Oatlands, on the 8th of August, 1540, at Hampton Court Palace. 10 days of strange, suspended transition. Married to the king, known within the inner circle of the court to be his new wife, but not yet formally acknowledged in the role that would determine every aspect of her life from that point forward. During those 10 days, London buzzed with the rumours and speculation that always accompanied a major change at the court. The whispers running through the taverns and the streets and the houses of merchants and nobles alike. Who was she, this new queen? What had happened to the German wife? What did the change mean for the great factions and alliances that were always shifting and competing around the centre of royal power? The proclamation at Hampton Court was the moment when Catherine's queenship became official, undeniable, visible to the entire world, and Hampton Court itself was the stage upon which her life as queen would primarily be played out. The palace that more than any other represented the height of Tudor royal magnificence in 1540, the most extraordinary royal residence in England, the place Henry had spent years and truly immense sums of money transforming from Cardinal Wolsey's private glory into an expression of royal power on the grandest imaginable scale. Hampton Court was overwhelming in the way that spaces designed to overwhelm always are, deliberately, intentionally, architecturally overwhelming, constructed and decorated with the specific purpose of making everyone who passed through it feel the physical weight of royal authority pressing down from every gilded surface and every carefully maintained garden view. The great hall, with its magnificent hammer-beam ceiling and its walls hung with enormous tapestries of extraordinary quality depicting the life of Abraham, was large enough to host hundreds of people for the formal dinners and ceremonies that were the regular business of royal life. The Chapel Royal, its vaulted ceiling, a masterwork of gilded fan vault plasterwork that floated above the worshippers in a space of peculiar ethereal beauty, was one of the most beautiful rooms in England. The kitchens could produce meals for hundreds simultaneously. The gardens extended toward the river in elaborate geometric formality. Hedges and flower beds and fountains arranged with the same precision that governed every other aspect of the palace's extraordinary appearance. Catherine moved into the Queen's apartments and began the work of being a queen. The Queen's apartments at Hampton Court had been originally designed with Anne Boleyn in mind, decorated with Anne's devices and heraldic imagery, partially renovated for Jane Seymour after Anne's execution, and never quite finished in the subsequent years of uncertainty. Catherine was the first queen consort to fully inhabit these rooms in the way they had been intended, and she brought her household into them and set herself to learning, day by day, what being the Queen of England actually required. What it required was enormous. The Queen's household needed managing. Ladies in waiting, attendants and servants of multiple ranks and functions, officials responsible for the administration of the Queen's domestic affairs, chaplains and musicians, and all the supporting infrastructure of a great royal establishment. She had formal obligations to fulfill in the ceremonial life of the court, the receptions, the religious observances, the formal audiences, the endless social performances that royal life demanded from those at its centre. She had relationships to navigate with the king's children, with Mary, the eldest, who was 7 years older than her new stepmother, and who made her feelings about the situation known with a coolness that bordered on contempt, with young Elizabeth, who was barely 7 years old, but who was already the daughter of a queen, who had been beheaded, and who looked at the world around her with the careful, watchful intelligence of a child who had learned early to pay close attention. She had foreign ambassadors to receive and impress, knowing that their reports about the new English Queen would be read by rulers across Europe and would shape England's diplomatic relationships in ways she could not fully anticipate. She came to all of this without preparation, without a mentor, without anyone who was genuinely invested in her success for reasons beyond their own political interests. She had her uncle Norfolk's backing, but Norfolk's investment in Catherine was purely instrumental. He had placed her at court to serve his political agenda, and his interest in her extended only as far as her usefulness to that agenda. She had the Dowager Duchess, who had some residual connection to her ward, but who had already demonstrated the limited nature of her actual care for Catherine's well-being. She had the courtiers and ladies who surrounded her, all of whom were professionally obligated to serve her, but none of whom could be entirely trusted with her genuine interests or her private vulnerabilities. She was, in the most practical sense of the word, on her own. And yet she managed. This is one of the most striking things about Catherine Howard's performance as Queen, and it deserves to be noted clearly. She was better at it than the circumstances of her preparation gave her any right to expect. Those who observed her in the early months of her queenship, and there were many careful observers, including foreign diplomats, whose professional assessments of her were neither sentimental nor flattering by default, consistently described her as more charming and more gracious than they had anticipated. She was warm in her interactions with people, genuinely so, not merely performing the warmth that was socially required, but projecting something that read as real. She was generous, open-handed with gifts and attention, and small gestures of kindness in the way that people who have experienced the absence of generosity sometimes become when they are suddenly in a position to provide it. She moved through the elaborate ceremonies of court life with an enthusiasm that read as genuine pleasure rather than laboured duty. Henry, watching his young queen in these early months, was openly and uncomplainingly proud of her. He gave her expensive gifts with a regularity and a lavishness that expressed his feelings more eloquently than any words. Jewels, furs, properties, expensive fabrics, the material vocabulary of royal infatuation. He attended her company whenever his health allowed. He spoke of her with warmth to his counsellors and his attendants. He told anyone who would listen that she had given him something he had feared was gone from his life forever. Some sense of joy in existing, some capacity for genuine happiness that the long accumulated weight of his years and his marriages and his griefs had almost entirely erased. He called her his rose without a thorn. He believed it when he said it. The Christmas festivities of 1540 were the high water mark of Catherine Howard's queenship, the moment when everything she had managed to achieve in the months since her proclamation came together in the particular splendour that the Tudor court could produce, when the king was happy and the occasion was given every resource it required. Hampton Court at Christmas was a place of extraordinary sensory richness. The great hall blazing with candles and torchlight, the tapestries warmed by firelight into colours deeper and richer than they showed by day, the smell of food and spiced wine and wood smoke filling every corridor, the sound of music and dancing filling every public space with the noise of celebration. Catherine presided over all of it with a radiance that impressed even the most sceptical of observers. She wore gowns of cloth of gold and deep, jewel-toned velvets, trimmed with costly fur. She danced with visible, genuine pleasure, not the controlled and careful dancing of someone performing an obligation, but the full-bodied enjoyment of someone who loved dancing and who was allowed in this setting to indulge that love. She distributed gifts with an open hand, and she achieved something that could have been extraordinarily awkward, and managed it instead with a grace that spoke well of her personal generosity. She welcomed Anne of Cleves to the Christmas celebrations, greeting her predecessor with warmth and apparent genuine friendliness, dancing with her, exchanging gifts, creating an atmosphere between them that was by all accounts comfortable and mutually pleasant. Henry watched this with visible satisfaction. It was exactly the kind of queenly behaviour he had hoped for, and it confirmed his conviction that in Catherine Howard he had finally found what he had been looking for. By April of 1541, rumours were circulating at court that Catherine might be pregnant. The French ambassador reported that preparations were underway in case the pregnancy proved real, and that a coronation was being considered for Whitsuntide if it did. This would have been transformative for Catherine's position. A royal pregnancy was the single most powerful thing a queen consort could offer, the one achievement that could most reliably and permanently secure her place at the king's side. But no pregnancy came. The rumours faded, and the coronation plans were quietly set aside, and Catherine's position, while still outwardly secure and publicly admired, was now shadowed by the knowledge that she had not yet given Henry the additional heir he still desired. She was 18 years old that spring, possibly not quite. She had been Queen of England for 8 months. She was navigating a role for which she had never been prepared, managing a marriage to a man more than 30 years her senior, who was increasingly difficult to be around physically and emotionally, and carrying within her a past that she knew, with a clarity that was probably constant and certainly terrifying, could destroy her if it ever came to light. The golden surface of the Hampton Court Christmas had been real while it lasted, but the ground beneath it was less stable than it appeared, and in the spring of 1541 it was beginning, quietly, to move. The complications that would eventually destroy Catherine Howard arrived in the form of people, specific individuals from her past who carried knowledge she needed to remain buried and who had various reasons, some calculating and some merely reckless, to make that knowledge dangerous. They did not arrive all at once. They arrived gradually, one appearing and then another, each one adding to the pressure that was building beneath the surface of the Queen's apparently stable and celebrated life, until the accumulated weight of what they knew and what they wanted became something she could not manage or contain. The first and most immediately threatening was Francis Dereham. Dereham had returned from Ireland before Catherine became queen. He had been back in the Duchess's household in the period immediately preceding Catherine's elevation to the court, and he had watched from that modest position as the woman he had once called his wife was transformed into the most powerful woman in England. Whatever he felt about this transformation, whatever mixture of pride and bitterness and entitlement accompanied his observation of it, the practical conclusion he drew from it was clear. Catherine's elevation was an opportunity that he intended to benefit from. He believed, with the persistent and somewhat dangerous conviction of a man who had decided something and was not inclined to revise his view, that the intimacy they had shared gave him a claim on her present good fortune that she was obligated to honor. He began to make that claim. He arrived at court seeking employment in the Queen's household. His approach was not subtle. He made it clear, in conversations with members of the household and in his manner of presenting his request, that he and the Queen had a connection that was different in kind from the ordinary connection between a job seeker and a potential employer. He spoke about her with a familiarity that was entirely inappropriate to the situation. He referenced their past in terms that were dangerously suggestive of what that past had actually contained. He pressed his case with the confidence of someone who believed he held leverage that made refusal risky. He was correct that he held leverage. The knowledge he possessed, the details of the relationship in the maiden's chamber at Lambeth, the nights he had spent in the dormitory, the language of husband and wife that they had used, the intimacy that had been witnessed by half a dozen other young women who were theoretically still available to testify about it, was information that could destroy the Queen of England if it became widely known and was taken up by the wrong people. Catherine knew this. Whatever options she had available to her were constrained from the beginning by the fact that simply refusing Dereham was not clearly safe. If he felt refused and turned against her, the consequences could be catastrophic. And so, she made the decision that historians have almost universally identified as the worst of her brief reign. She appointed Dereham as her personal secretary. The reasoning is understandable, even if the decision was catastrophically counterproductive. Bringing Dereham formally into her household seemed, perhaps, like a way of managing the threat he represented, giving him what he wanted in a controlled way, keeping him close where she could monitor him, reducing the risk that a rejected Dereham would take his knowledge elsewhere. The Dowager Duchess, who retained some influence over Catherine, and who had her own reasons for wanting the situation contained, may have encouraged this approach. Catherine herself, operating under enormous pressure without anyone to advise her properly, may have been genuinely unable to see a better option from where she was standing. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was the opposite of what was intended. Instead of neutralizing the Dereham problem, the appointment formalized it, gave him official access to the Queen, and created a documented record of his presence in her household that could never be erased. And Dereham, installed in his new position, did not become more discreet. He became more aggressive. He bragged about his closeness with the Queen in terms that were far too familiar for a secretary. He addressed her with an informality that was noticed and commented upon by others in the household. He arrived at her chambers at inappropriate hours. He pushed boundaries that a man in his position had no business pushing. Apparently emboldened by the access his appointment provided, rather than sobered by the risks of his behavior, he was, in the plainest possible terms, an ongoing crisis that the decision to employ him had failed entirely to defuse. And while the Dereham problem was developing its own momentum, another complication was simultaneously growing from different soil. Thomas Culpeper had not disappeared from Catherine's awareness. He was present at court daily, in his capacity as a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber, a position that placed him in close proximity to the King himself, and that gave him a visibility and a social ease in the royal household that were entirely natural to someone of his background and his royal favour. He was young, which in the world of the aging Henry's court was itself a kind of distinction. He was handsome, which in any court was a currency. He was charming in the particular way of young men, who have always been told by the world around them that they are charming, and who have never had serious reason to doubt it. He had a darker history beneath the attractive surface. There was credible evidence, documented in legal records from before his rise to court prominence, that he had been involved in serious violence, that he had been accused of rape and of murder, crimes for which he had faced no legal consequences because the favour of the king was, in Henry's England, a sufficient protection against almost any accusation. This was the world Catherine Howard inhabited, a world where beauty and royal approval were armour against accountability, where the most dangerous people were often the most attractive and the most socially secure. She had grown up in a version of this world in the Duchess's household, where the absence of supervision had allowed similar dynamics to operate on a smaller and less spectacular scale. Whatever awareness Catherine had of Culpeper's darker history, and she may have had very little, given that the court was not inclined to discuss the past misdeeds of a royal favourite in any setting where such discussion might reach the favourite's ears, she appears to have experienced him primarily as the young man she had noticed when she first arrived at court, the one she had briefly thought of as someone she might marry before the entirely different and vastly more overwhelming prospect of the king's own attention had made such thoughts irrelevant. In the spring of 1541, something between them intensified. The exact mechanics of how the connection developed beyond the general acquaintance of two people living in the same court world are not entirely clear from the surviving evidence. What is clear is that by Easter of 1541, Culpeper was seeking private time with Catherine that went beyond what the ordinary social life of the court provided, and that Catherine's most trusted lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, had been drawn into the role of facilitating those private meetings. Jane Boleyn was a woman of considerable experience and complicated history, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother George, who had himself been executed alongside his sister in 1536. She had survived the fall of two queens, had navigated the court's dangerous waters with enough skill to maintain a position of genuine seniority and trust, and had established herself in Catherine's household as one of the most relied upon of the Queen's attendants. Her decision to help arrange the meetings between Catherine and Culpeper is one that historians have puzzled over without arriving at a fully satisfying explanation. Perhaps she was genuinely attached to Catherine and wanted to help her in whatever way seemed most immediately useful. Perhaps the dynamics of the situation made refusal feel impossible. Perhaps she was making a calculation of her own that the meetings represented a manageable risk. Whatever her reasoning, she became the mechanism through which the meetings were made possible, and her role in enabling them would ultimately cost her her life. The meetings happened. In the evenings, after the formal activities of the day had concluded and the king had retired, with Jane stationed outside a closed door, Catherine and Culpeper spent time together that was private, in a way that no other aspect of the Queen's life was private. Whether those meetings involved physical intimacy in the full sense, whether the adultery that would eventually be charged was real in the most direct physical meaning of the word, is something that the surviving evidence does not resolve definitively. Culpeper himself denied full physical intimacy when questioned under conditions that gave him very little incentive to protect Catherine. But the meetings were real. The intimacy of them was real. And Catherine's feelings were genuine and documented in the only letter in her own hand that has survived to the present day. It is a letter that deserves to be considered with some care. It is not a long letter or a polished one. It has the grammar and spelling of someone who is literate, but not deeply educated, someone who writes from feeling rather than from formal training or political calculation. In it, Catherine told Culpeper that her heart longed to be with him. She expressed pain at not being able to see him. She asked him to remember her. She sent him tokens of her affection. She signed herself his as long as life endures. Culpeper called her, in the language they used between themselves, his little sweet fool, a phrase that carries the condescension that his social confidence and his gender always gave him over her, but that carries also something genuinely tender, something that speaks to a relationship in which feeling was present on both sides, whatever form that feeling took. She was the Queen of England when she wrote that letter. She was also, beneath all of that, a young woman who had grown up without adequate love or protection, who had been placed in a magnificent trap by people who never truly cared about her well-being, and who had found in Thomas Culpeper stolen hours, closed doors, Jane Boleyn standing guard, something that felt, in the midst of all the impossibility, like something true. It would cost her everything. The royal progress of the summer of 1541 was one of the great ceremonial demonstrations of Tudor royal power in the latter years of Henry VIII's reign, a journey of several months through the English Midlands and the northern counties, designed with the deliberate political purpose of making the king's presence felt in regions where the memory of the Pilgrimage of Grace, the great religious uprising of 1536, was still very much alive, and where the king's authority required the kind of personal, visible reinforcement that no amount of governance from a distance could adequately provide. The Pilgrimage of Grace had been, by any measure, the most serious domestic challenge Henry had faced during his kingship. It had begun in Lincolnshire in the autumn of 1536 and had spread with alarming speed through Yorkshire and the north, ultimately involving tens of thousands of people, men and women of every social class, from great nobles to the humblest agricultural workers, who had taken to the roads and the fields in protest against the dissolution of the monasteries and the religious changes that Henry had imposed on England in the wake of his break with Rome. The monasteries were not merely religious institutions for the communities they served. They were centers of charity and medical care, providers of hospitality to travelers, managers of agricultural land that employed thousands of people, repositories of education and learning in regions where these things were otherwise difficult to access. Their dissolution had disrupted communities throughout the north in ways that were felt immediately and practically, and the popular resistance had been correspondingly intense. Henry had put down the uprising through a combination of promises and force, promising reforms he had no intention of actually making, waiting until the immediate crisis had subsided, and then executing the leaders with a thoroughness designed to discourage any future repetition. The executions had been extensive. The promises had been broken. The underlying tensions that had produced the uprising had not been resolved, and the north of England remained, in 1541, a region where the king's authority was less thoroughly established than it was in the south, where old religious loyalties were deeply rooted and not easily redirected, and where the great northern nobles who had been associated with the uprising, or who had been sympathetically regarded by the rebels, needed to be reminded of the realities of their obligations to the crown. The progress was the mechanism for delivering that reminder. Henry and Catherine set out from Hampton Court at the end of June, accompanied by a retinue of several thousand people, councillors, courtiers, household staff, military attendants, officials of every description, that constituted a moving city advancing through the English landscape at the stately pace appropriate to royal travel. They stopped at great houses and cathedral cities and market towns along the route, receiving the hospitality of local nobles and the ceremonial addresses of loyal civic authorities, giving the people of the north the visual spectacle of their king and queen in person. making the abstract reality of royal power into something concrete and visible. For Catherine, the progress was an unbroken succession of demands. She was required to be present at ceremony after ceremony, to present herself as the gracious and dignified queen consort at receptions and formal dinners and public appearances throughout the long summer months. She was required to look magnificent at all times, the visual embodiment of royal power and its feminine complement, in gown after gown, wearing jewel after jewel, maintaining the composure and the energy of queenly performance even when she was exhausted and anxious, and the private complications of her life were pressing on her from directions that the public ceremonial life of the progress gave her no space to address, because Culpeper was travelling with them. His position as a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber meant that his presence in the travelling court was entirely routine, entirely expected, raising no eyebrows and requiring no explanation. He was simply part of the royal household, present in the daily life of the progress in all the same ways he had been present in the daily life of Hampton Court. The proximity that the progress created, both the general proximity of everyone travelling in the same enormous retinue, and the more specific proximity of the Queen's household and the King's household moving through the same succession of stopping places, kept the connection between Catherine and Culpeper alive and present in ways that might, under different circumstances, have been more easily managed by distance. And so, the meetings continued in the houses and abbeys and great castle residences, where the progress stopped along its route. Jane Boleyn made them possible. At Lincoln, at Pontefract, at Hatfield, and other locations as the court moved through the north and then turned south again, Catherine and Culpeper found ways to be together in the evenings, when the formal business of the day had concluded. The doors closed. Jane stood watch. The meetings lasted for hours. Witnesses who would later testify about these encounters described them in terms that left no ambiguity about the emotional significance of what was happening, whatever the precise physical details of the encounters might have been. This letter Catherine had written to Culpeper had expressed the longing of someone who wanted to be with a person she could not safely be with. The progress was, in its strange and complicated way, a kind of extended enactment of that longing. Months of daily proximity combined with meetings that were stolen from the constraints of a life that was almost entirely public and almost entirely observed. It was reckless in ways that cannot be minimized. Every meeting was a risk. Every hour that Jane spent standing guard, every message passed between them, every closed door in every stopping place along the route was a potential piece of evidence, was indeed, as it turned out, actual evidence that was gathered and used. Dereham was also travelling with the progress in his capacity as the Queen's secretary, and his behaviour continued to create additional problems that compounded everything else Catherine was managing. At Pontefract, one of the major stopping points of the Northern Tour, he was present in the Queen's chambers at hours entirely inappropriate to his official role. He made remarks about his connection with Catherine that were far too familiar for a secretary addressing a queen. He pushed for access that his role did not entitle him to, apparently emboldened by the knowledge he possessed and by the appointment that had formalized his position in the household. He was, as he had always been since Catherine made the catastrophic decision to employ him, a loose element in an already extremely dangerous situation, capable of creating explosive consequences through carelessness or through deliberate aggression, and Catherine had very limited ability to control either possibility. It was at Pontefract, at some point during the late summer of 1541, that Catherine made the formal written appointment of Dereham as her official secretary, confirming in documented form the arrangement that had existed more informally before. The reasons for making this formalization at this particular point are not entirely clear from the surviving evidence. Perhaps Dereham had been pushing for something more official, some documented acknowledgement that would make his position harder to revoke. Perhaps Catherine calculated that a formal appointment gave her more control over the situation than an informal one. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was to create an official paper trail connecting Dereham formally to the Queen's household, a record that would be discovered and examined during the investigation that was coming, and that could be interpreted in ways that made an already terrible situation considerably worse. The progress turned south in the autumn, and the court moved back toward Hampton Court through the cooling English landscape. Officially, the progress had been a success. Henry had received the submissions he had come for, had made his presence felt in the north in the ways that the political purpose of the journey required, and was returning home satisfied with the ceremonial results of the expedition. Catherine had performed her role throughout with the composure and grace that had always been among her most reliable qualities, maintaining the public presentation of a gracious and devoted queen through months of continuous demand. But beneath the successful surface of the progress, everything was moving toward a crisis. The meetings with Culpeper were documented in the memories of multiple witnesses. Dereham's behavior had been observed and noted by members of the household. The investigation that would reveal everything was not yet underway, but the information that would fuel it existed, distributed among the people who had seen things and the people who had been told things and the people who were, right now, deciding what to do with what they knew. The court arrived back at Hampton Court on the 30th of October, 1541. Henry announced that a special Thanksgiving service would be held to celebrate the success of the progress and to give thanks for the happiness of his marriage. He attended the service the following morning with the public contentment of a man who had no idea what was coming. He would not be content for very much longer. The 1st of November, 1541, was the Feast of All Saints, a major observance in the religious calendar that Henry VIII maintained even after his break with Rome, one of the traditional holy days that survived the religious upheaval of the Reformation, because Henry had never been a theological Protestant in any straightforward sense, and because the rhythms of Catholic devotional practice were too deeply embedded in English life to be easily or entirely stripped away. The court assembled at Hampton Court for Mass, and Henry attended with the outward piety and apparent satisfaction of a man who felt himself at peace with God and with his circumstances. He had, according to the records of that morning, asked the Bishop of Lincoln to make prayer and give thanks with him for the good life he led, and hoped to continue leading with his queen. It was a public expression of gratitude, sincere, by all evidence, in the way that Henry's expressions of feeling tended to be sincere in the moment of their expression, even when they were destined to look, in retrospect, deeply ironic. He was thanking God for the happiness of his marriage on the last morning he would ever feel that happiness. He was giving thanks for something he was about to lose. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was at Hampton Court that day, and in his keeping was a letter that had been composed on the basis of information provided by a man named John Lascelles, whose sister Mary Hall had lived in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household at the same time as Catherine Howard, and who had witnessed what happened in the Maiden's Chamber at Lambeth, and who had told her brother about it in enough detail that Lascelles had concluded it was his duty to bring the information to the attention of the authorities. Lascelles was a Protestant reformer, a man of genuine religious conviction who believed fervently in the Reformation cause, and who regarded the conservative Howard faction at court as a dangerous impediment to England's proper religious development. Catherine Howard, as the niece of the arch-conservative Duke of Norfolk, was the living embodiment of Howard influence at the center of royal power. Whether Lascelles' decision to share what his sister had told him was primarily driven by religious and political calculation, by genuine belief in the duty to expose wrongdoing, or by some combination of both, the information he brought to Cranmer was real, and its implications were serious. Cranmer, who had received this information several days before All Saints' Day, and who had spent those days conducting quiet preliminary inquiries to assess its credibility, had determined that it was serious enough to require Henry's attention. He was afraid to tell the king in person. This fear was entirely understandable. Henry's emotional responses to information that challenged his self-image or wounded his personal attachments were powerful, rapid, and unpredictable. And the specific information Cranmer was carrying was exactly the kind that would produce exactly that kind of response. Delivering such news verbally, face to face, in the immediate and uncontrollable moment of Henry's first reaction, was the kind of task that could go catastrophically wrong in ways that might not be survivable for the person delivering it. So Cranmer committed the information to a letter. He summarized what he had learned: the allegations regarding Catherine's behavior in the Duchess's household, the names of the men involved, the nature of what had occurred, and he placed the letter where Henry would find it in private, alone, without an audience who might observe the king's immediate and unguarded response. He left it in or near the Chapel Royal, where Henry would encounter it in the reflective aftermath of the All Saints' Mass, in a moment of relative solitude. Then Cranmer withdrew to wait. Henry found the letter and read it. The world it described was so contrary to everything he had believed about his queen, so entirely incompatible with the image of Catherine as his rose without a thorn, his late and perfect blessing, the gift that God had sent to restore joy to a life that had been stripped of it by grief and disappointment, that his initial response was disbelief. He refused, in the first hours, to accept what the letter told him. He ordered an investigation, apparently genuinely hoping that it would prove the accusations false and demonstrate Lascelles and his sister to be liars motivated by some personal or political grudge. But the investigation did not clear Catherine. Cranmer led the questioning with the thorough, careful attention of a man who understood that the results would be scrutinized at the highest possible level, and who was determined that the process, whatever it produced, would be defensible. He questioned witnesses from the Duchess's household, the former maids of honor and attendants who had shared the maiden's chamber with Catherine, who had been present during the nighttime visits, who had heard what was said and seen what was done. He questioned Henry Manox, who provided a detailed account of his own behavior with Catherine during the music lessons at Horsham. He questioned Francis Dereham, whose answers required careful management of what he admitted and what he attempted to conceal, but who could not entirely deny what so many other witnesses were willing to confirm. The picture that emerged from these testimonies was exactly what the letter had described, and in some respects it was more extensive. The relationship with Manox was confirmed. The relationship with Dereham was confirmed. Catherine's own testimony, extracted under direct questioning, confirmed the essential outline of both relationships, though she framed them in language that emphasized Dereham's persistence and her own youth and confusion, descriptions that were accurate as far as they went, but that could not alter the fundamental facts of what had occurred. And then, as the investigation deepened, the name of Thomas Culpeper began to appear. The letters that Catherine had written to Culpeper were found. Jane Boleyn was questioned at length, under conditions of increasing emotional and psychological pressure, and the testimony she eventually provided described the meetings during the Northern Progress in enough detail to make their existence and their intimate character entirely clear. Culpeper himself was questioned and denied full physical adultery, but his denials could not undo the evidence of the letters and the meetings that the investigation had assembled. Henry received the findings with a devastation that his counsellors described in terms that suggested genuine personal grief alongside the political fury. He wept, a loss of composure that was unusual enough for a man who had always exercised considerable control over his public presentation to be remarked upon by multiple observers. He raged. He accused those around him of having allowed him to be deceived. He expressed, in the disordered emotion of those first days, regrets about decisions he had previously embraced, including the execution of Thomas Cromwell, which he now apparently believed had been a mistake driven by bad counsel rather than sound judgment. But beneath the grief and the rage, the political machinery was already in motion. Henry had not survived 30 years as King of England without developing an instinctive capacity for translating personal hurt into political action, and the investigation that he had ordered in the hope of clearing Catherine was transforming, as the evidence accumulated, into the legal foundation for a proceeding that would have a predetermined outcome. The king had been hurt. The king had been humiliated, and Henry VIII, when hurt and humiliated, did not respond with forgiveness or patience or measured reflection. He responded with the full weight of royal power, directed at the source of the hurt. Catherine, meanwhile, had been confined to her rooms in Hampton Court from the moment the investigation began to produce its findings. She was not yet formally under arrest, but the machinery of confinement was assembling itself around her with terrible efficiency. Guards appeared at the doors of her apartments. Her household was being systematically interviewed. Ladies who were taken for questioning did not all return. The world of Hampton Court, which had been the stage of her greatest successes barely a year before, was closing in from every direction. It was in this period of suffocating confinement, the doors watched, the household fragmenting, the investigation producing results that she could not see, but whose gravity she could feel in the atmosphere of fear that had settled over everything around her, that Catherine broke. She managed somehow to slip away from the guards who watched her rooms, and she ran. She ran down the long gallery that connected the royal apartments to the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, the gallery that she had walked through dozens of times as queen, in jewels and magnificent gowns, attended by her ladies, with the unhurried dignity of a woman at home in her own palace. She ran through it now in an entirely different manner, her footsteps loud on the stone floor, her voice raised in desperate cries for the king, screaming his name, screaming for him to come to her, screaming with the full-throated desperation of a teenager who was about to lose everything and who was running toward the one person in the world who had the power to prevent it. The guards intercepted her before she reached the Chapel Royal. They seized her and held her while she continued to cry out. Henry was in the chapel. He did not come out. Whether he heard her screaming and chose not to respond, or whether the sounds of the gallery did not penetrate the chapel walls, the result was the same. Catherine was dragged back to her rooms, still screaming, while the chapel door remained closed. She never saw Henry again. The gallery at Hampton Court, where this happened, is still called the Haunted Gallery. The people who work there and the visitors who come have been telling stories about sounds in that corridor, about figures seen briefly and then gone, for centuries. What is not a story, what is solid historical fact, is that a girl of 18 ran down that corridor screaming for help that did not come, and was pulled back into captivity, and the door she was running toward never opened. On the 14th of November, 1541, Catherine was removed from Hampton Court and taken to Sion House in Middlesex, a former monastery on the north bank of the Thames, where she was placed under formal confinement. Her title was stripped from her 12 days later. She was left in the growing cold of the English autumn to wait. Sion House was cold in winter, as converted monasteries tend to be, buildings designed for the austere discipline of monastic life, rather than the comfort of aristocratic habitation, their long stone corridors and high-ceilinged rooms retaining the chill of the season, long after whatever fires were lit, had done their best to counter it. In the weeks and months that Catherine Howard spent there in the winter of 1541 and early 1542, the cold was one of the physical realities of her confinement that those who attended her occasionally remarked upon. The other was the silence of a world from which she had been entirely removed, a world that was proceeding without her in the palaces and the council chambers and the diplomatic dispatches of Tudor England, making its decisions and reaching its conclusions about her fate without any meaningful participation from her. The historical record from Catherine's time at Sion House is thin in the particular way that historical records become thin when the subject has been removed from the field of observation that normally generates historical documentation. There are no ambassadorial reports from this period, because ambassadors had no reason to visit or observe a disgraced former queen confined to a country house. There are no letters from Catherine herself, no personal accounts of her state of mind, nothing that gives us direct access to her inner life during the months she spent there. What we have are the accounts of those who attended her, a few indirect references in the records of the legal proceedings, and the capacity to infer from what we know about human psychology what a person in her specific circumstances was likely to have experienced. What those sources and that inference suggest is a long and terrible period of oscillation between fear and a desperate, diminishing hope. Fear because Catherine understood, with increasing clarity as the weeks passed and the investigation continued, and the news from London was uniformly bad, that the situation she was in was not one from which ordinary survival was likely. Hope because, and this is one of the most poignant aspects of the entire story, there was a period when Catherine appears to have believed that a specific legal argument might save her, the argument of the pre-contract. Thomas Cranmer, who was conducting the investigation with genuine legal thoroughness, had raised with Henry the possibility that if Catherine and Dereham had actually exchanged vows of intention to marry before her marriage to the king, then the royal marriage had never been legally valid in the first place. A marriage contracted while one party was already bound by a pre-contract to another person was a marriage that could be declared void, not merely annulled, a nullity from the beginning, rather than a valid union that had been terminated. And if the marriage to Henry had never been valid, then Catherine could not have committed adultery within it, because you cannot commit adultery against a marriage that does not exist. The charge of adultery, and by extension the charge of treason, would be significantly undermined. Catherine refused this argument. In her interrogations, conducted by Cranmer and other officials, in sessions that must have been among the most terrifying experiences of her life, she consistently denied that any pre-contract had existed between herself and Dereham. She insisted instead that the relationship had been something done to her against her will, that Dereham had compelled her through persistent pressure and manipulation, and that she had been a victim rather than a willing participant in what had occurred between them. She described his conduct as rape. Why Catherine refused the potentially life-saving argument of the pre-contract is one of the questions about her story that historians have found genuinely difficult to answer. She had no legal counsel. No lawyer had been appointed to advise her, to map the legal terrain of her situation, to help her understand the implications of different positions she might take in the interrogations. She was making decisions in conditions of extreme isolation and fear, without anyone who was genuinely invested in helping her survive, rather than simply in establishing the facts that the prosecution needed. It is entirely possible that she never fully understood that claiming the pre-contract might have saved her life. It is possible that she refused because she could not bring herself, even under these extreme pressures, to characterize the relationship with Dereham as a mutual and freely chosen betrothal, when her experience of it had been so different from that description, that she could not call him her husband in a legal proceeding, when the emotional reality of what she had lived through made that framing feel like a betrayal of her own experience. It is possible she was given bad advice. The historical record does not tell us clearly, and the question remains one of the genuine mysteries of her story. What is clear is that by refusing the pre-contract argument, Catherine eliminated the one legal pathway that might have led to a lesser outcome than the one that was coming. Without that pathway, the case against her was built on the acknowledged relationships, the discovered letter, the testimony of Jane Boleyn about the meetings with Culpeper, and the framework of a legal system that was designed to reach a specific conclusion, rather than to adjudicate a genuine legal question. The conclusion had been reached by the king. The process was the formality. In London, through November and December of 1541, the process moved with its terrible efficiency. Culpeper and Dereham were arrested and questioned. On the 1st of December, they were arraigned at the Guildhall on charges of high treason, and the verdict was never genuinely in doubt. On the 10th of December, both men were executed at Tyburn. Culpeper received the relative mercy of beheading, a swift death, a clean end. Dereham suffered the full traitor's death, hanged, cut down while still living, subjected to the full horror of the traitor's penalty. Their heads were displayed on spikes on London Bridge. In December, the members of the Howard and Tilney families who had been in the Duchess's household were tried for misprision of treason, the crime of having known of treasonous conduct and failing to report it. The Dowager Duchess herself, whose negligence had made everything possible, was among those found guilty. Several of Catherine's relatives were imprisoned. The Duke of Norfolk, who had placed Catherine at court as his political pawn, had already retreated to his country estate and written a letter to the king in which he expressed his profound horror and shame at his niece's behaviour and his stepmother's failings, laying all possible blame on the women of the family while emphasizing his own loyalty and devotion to his sovereign. He was not imprisoned. He survived as he had survived everything, by calculating his interests perfectly and never allowing loyalty or sentiment to interfere with those calculations. Christmas came to Sion House and passed in silence. January arrived. On the 29th of January, 1542, a bill of attainder against Catherine was introduced in Parliament. The bill declared it treason for an unchaste woman to marry the king, a law that had never existed before, created specifically and transparently to reach one specific person, requiring no trial, no evidentiary standard of proof, no opportunity for Catherine to speak in her own defence. Parliament passed it on the 7th of February. Henry signed the death warrant on the 11th. 2 days later, Catherine was moved from Sion House and brought by barge down the Thames to the Tower of London. The Tower of London, in the winter of 1542, was, as it had been for centuries, many things simultaneously. A fortress, its great stone walls and towers rising along the north bank of the Thames as a permanent expression of the power that had built them and the power they were still designed to contain. An arsenal and a treasury and a zoo and a palace in its various functioning departments, and most relevantly on the cold February morning when Catherine Howard arrived there by barge from Sion House, a prison, the prison to which people of significance were sent when the king's displeasure had hardened past the point of management or negotiation, the place from which the road forward ran in very few directions, and the most common of those directions was toward a scaffold. Catherine arrived through the Traitor's Gate, the Watergate entrance cut into the tower's outer wall at river level, through which the Thames flowed in, and through which prisoners were delivered directly into the tower's custody, without the public exposure of an overland journey through the city streets. She had travelled by barge, watching the familiar shape of the London waterfront change and rearrange itself as the boat moved upriver from Sion, watching the tower grow larger on the north bank until it was the only thing in the landscape worth looking at. Massive, stone grey, absolute. She had known it was coming. The weeks at Sion House had been long enough, and the news from London had been clear enough in its direction, that whatever desperate hope Catherine had clung to in the early weeks of her confinement had been progressively eroded by the accumulating reality of what the investigation had produced and what the Parliament was now enacting into law. The Bill of Attainder had made the situation legally definitive. The death warrant had made it practically unavoidable. The barge journey was simply the last transit, from one form of waiting to another form that would not last very long. The Queen's apartments in the Tower, where royal prisoners of Catherine's rank were housed, were not comfortable in the way that a palace was comfortable, but they were not the dungeon conditions that popular imagination sometimes associates with Tower imprisonment. They were cold. February in London was cold, and stone buildings of medieval construction did not retain heat well. And they were watched, and they were the rooms in which Catherine would spend the final days of her life, but they were not the deliberately punishing environment of the lowest Tower cells. She had attendants with her, a reduced household of the servants who had remained with her through her imprisonment, and she was treated with the residual formality that her former queenship was apparently still considered to demand, at least in the practical details of her accommodation. There is a story told about Catherine's final evening before her execution, a story that appears in several accounts, and that historians have neither been able to fully verify nor to dismiss with complete confidence. The story is that Catherine asked for the execution block to be brought to her room. She wanted to practice. She wanted to rehearse the act of kneeling and laying her head upon the block, so that on the following morning, in the public moment of her execution, she would be able to perform the act without hesitation, or the kind of visible physical distress that might undo the composure she was determined to maintain. She wanted to do it with dignity, and the only way she could be confident of doing it with dignity was to practice it beforehand, to reduce the terrifying novelty of the physical act through rehearsal, so that her body would know what to do when the moment came. Whether this story is literally and precisely true is something we cannot fully establish, but it carries the ring of psychological truth about a specific kind of person in a specific kind of situation. Catherine Howard had grown up managing herself, had learned very early that composure was a form of control available even to those who had been stripped of every other form of control, had practiced throughout her life the presentation of steadiness in the face of circumstances that made steadiness difficult, that she would have applied this same instinct to the final and most demanding performance of her life, would have sought to rehearse the scaffold in the privacy of her room, so that the public performance of it could be as controlled and as dignified as possible, is entirely consistent with everything else we know about her character. On the morning of the 13th of February, 1542, Catherine Howard was escorted from her apartments within the Tower to the scaffold that had been erected on Tower Green. Tower Green was the small, enclosed grassy space within the Tower's inner precinct, not Tower Hill, where public executions were held before large crowds of ordinary Londoners, but the more private space inside the walls, where the executions of people of very high status were carried out with a somewhat more contained audience. The scaffold itself was simple, unadorned, without the ceremonial preparations that had accompanied the execution of Anne Boleyn 6 years earlier. No special French executioner, no black drapery, no elaborate formality. It was bare wood, functional, a statement in its very plainness about how completely Catherine had been stripped of the royal status that had briefly been hers. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, was executed alongside her on the same morning. Jane had spent the months of her imprisonment in a state of severe psychological distress that contemporaries described as madness, a complete breakdown of the composure and the capacity for coherent function that suggested genuine mental illness rather than mere grief or fear. The government had been confronted with the legal problem that English law did not permit the execution of someone who was genuinely incapable of understanding their situation and the charges against them. The government had responded to this problem by passing a new act, specifically permitting the execution of the insane for treason, bending the law to fit the political requirement with the characteristic flexibility that Henry's administration had always displayed when specific outcomes were required. Jane Boleyn was executed. The law had been made to accommodate it. The small assembly of witnesses gathered on Tower Green watched as Catherine mounted the steps of the scaffold. She made a short speech, the custom of the time, the final public words of the condemned, given in the expectation that they would be heard and reported, and that they would serve to confirm the prisoner's acknowledgement of their guilt and the justice of the court's proceeding. The precise words of Catherine's final speech vary slightly across the different accounts that survive from witnesses who were present, but the substance is consistent. She acknowledged her faults. She accepted the judgment that had been passed upon her. She asked those present to pray for her soul and to pray for the king, and she conducted herself throughout with a steadiness that the observers commented upon with what appears to be genuine admiration and surprise. Otwell Johnson, a London merchant with court connections, who left a written account of the execution, noted that both Catherine Howard and Jane Boleyn made the most godly and Christian's end that ever was desired. This is the language of someone who has been genuinely impressed by what he witnessed, someone who had perhaps expected more distress, more collapse, more visible evidence of the terror that must have been present beneath the composure, and who found instead two women dying with more dignity than the circumstances gave them any right to claim. There is a famous line attributed to Catherine's final words that appears in many popular accounts, a declaration that she died a queen, but would rather have died the wife of Thomas Culpeper. It is a resonant line, perfectly calibrated to capture something emotionally true about the tragedy of her situation. It has been repeated in histories and novels and dramatizations for generations. Historians are virtually unanimous in dismissing it as a later invention. Catherine's actual final words appear to have been what the contemporary accounts describe: brief, composed, dignified, without rhetorical flourish. After her speech, Catherine knelt at the block and placed her head upon it. The axe fell. It was over. She was buried that same day in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, within the tower's inner precinct, the small medieval church that had served for centuries as the burial place of those who died in the tower as prisoners of the crown. She was laid to rest without ceremony, without public mourning, without any of the formal observances that might have attended the burial of a queen under other circumstances. She was placed in the ground beside the remains of her cousin Anne Boleyn, who had died on the same scaffold 6 years before her, and who had, in so many ways, shown the path that Catherine's own story would follow. 2 Howard women, buried side by side in the Tower Chapel. 2 queens, 2 cousins, 2 young women consumed by the same machine of royal power and left in the same consecrated ground. Jane Boleyn was buried beside them both. The chapel doors closed. The February cold settled over the Tower of London, and the world that Catherine Howard had briefly illuminated with her warmth and her laughter and her genuine, unguarded humanity continued turning, as worlds do, toward the next thing. The world that Catherine Howard left behind in February of 1542 continued to function in all its complicated, indifferent, occasionally extraordinary ways. The people who had shaped her fate, who had placed her in danger or exploited her or used her or failed to protect her, went on living, most of them, for years or decades after she was gone, carrying the weight of what they had done or failed to do with whatever degree of consciousness the historical record allows us to assess. Henry VIII lived for 5 more years after Catherine's execution. They were not good years for him, by any measure that valued the quality of a life rather than merely its continuation. His health deteriorated steadily through those final years. The ulcerated leg that had been causing him chronic pain since the late 1530s grew worse, periodically becoming so severely inflamed that he could not walk and had to be moved through his palaces in a specially constructed chair. His weight continued to increase beyond even the impressive dimensions it had already reached. His moods, never reliable, became darker and more volatile and less predictable as the pain and the confinement and the gradual failure of his body compressed the emotional landscape of a man who had always lived expansively into something much narrower and more dangerous. He mourned Catherine in the particular way that Henry mourned things, intensely, briefly, and then not at all. He wept in the immediate aftermath of her fall. He expressed, to those closest to him, the grief and the wounded pride of a man who had genuinely believed in something and discovered that the thing he believed in was not what he had thought. And then, within a few months, the grief gave way to something more characteristic of the man he had always been: a resumed appetite for life, a renewed engagement with the world, a forward momentum that did not pause very long for any obstacle, including the deaths of wives. He expressed, repeatedly, and with apparent sincerity, regret about the execution of Thomas Cromwell, an acknowledgement that he had been led by bad counsel into destroying a man who had served him well, a recognition that the manipulation of his emotions against Cromwell had produced an outcome he would not have endorsed in a cooler moment. The regret was real enough to be reported by multiple observers. What it was not was accompanied by any meaningful acknowledgement of the role his own anger and his own susceptibility to emotional manipulation had played in what happened, or by any reflection on the structural similarities between Cromwell's fate and the fate of the young woman who had died 4 months later. In July of 1543, 14 months after Catherine's execution, Henry married for the 6th and final time. His new queen was Catherine Parr, a widow in her early 30s, educated in the humanist tradition, intelligent and politically astute in ways that her predecessors had variously been or not been, and possessed of the particular practical wisdom of a woman who understood exactly the kind of man she was marrying, and who had made a very clear-eyed calculation about how to survive that marriage while remaining as fully herself as the circumstances allowed. Catherine Parr was a remarkable woman, and she managed a remarkable feat. She survived Henry. She managed her husband with the skill of someone who had studied his character carefully before accepting the position of his wife, who understood when to yield and when to quietly hold her ground, who maintained genuine intellectual engagement with the questions of religion and learning that interested Henry, while carefully avoiding the kind of overt political assertiveness that had contributed to the destruction of Anne Boleyn. She bore his tempers, managed his pain, administered his household with efficiency, and when Henry died in January of 1547, she was still alive, which was more than could be said for 2 of the 5 women who had preceded her in his bed. Henry's death came in January of 1547, after a final rapid deterioration in health that moved too quickly for his physicians to manage, and that ended in the small hours of a January morning, with the death of the most powerful man England had seen in centuries. He was 55 years old. He had been king for 38 years. He had transformed his country's religion, broken it from Rome, dissolved its monasteries, executed hundreds of people, including 2 of his 6 wives, and left behind him an England that was simultaneously stronger and more deeply uncertain about its own identity than it had been when his reign began. He was buried at Windsor beside Jane Seymour, the wife who had given him his son. Prince Edward, that long-awaited and much celebrated son, ascended to the throne at the age of 9 and died at 15 of tuberculosis in 1553, having never reached adulthood. Henry's daughter Mary, Catherine of Aragon's child, the girl who had been displaced from the succession and had spent years in the cold shadow of her father's disregard, then became Queen of England, the first woman to rule England in her own right since the disputed reign of Matilda 4 centuries earlier. Mary reigned for 5 years, attempting with great sincerity and great political difficulty to reverse the Protestant religious changes of the 2 previous reigns and to restore England to the Roman Catholic practice she had never abandoned. She died in 1558 without an heir. And then Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the baby whose birth in 1533 had been received with such disappointment because she was not the son Henry wanted, the child whose mother had been executed when she was not yet 3 years old, became Queen of England. Elizabeth I would reign for 45 years. She would become one of the most extraordinary monarchs the country had ever known, presiding over a period of intellectual and artistic and commercial flowering that would be remembered for centuries as one of the great eras of English civilization. She would never marry. Whether the marriages she had watched in her childhood, the deaths of her mother, the execution of her stepmother Catherine Howard, the procession of Henry's wives and the fates they met, contributed to her famous determination to remain unwed, is a question historians have debated without resolution. What is certain is that the England Elizabeth governed was the England that Catherine Howard had briefly been queen of, shaped by the same reign and the same upheavals and the same extraordinary terrible man. The Duke of Norfolk, Catherine's uncle, survived everything. He survived the scandal of Catherine's fall and his own subsequent imprisonment in the Tower in the final years of Henry's reign, on charges related to his son's overreach. He survived a death warrant that was signed but never carried out because Henry died before it could be executed. He was released under Queen Mary, regained his titles and properties, and died in 1554 at approximately 80 years old, one of the most formidable political survivors of the entire Tudor century, a man who had outlasted all his contemporaries through the straightforward method of calculating his interests perfectly and never allowing sentiment or loyalty to complicate those calculations. He had abandoned Catherine as cleanly as he had abandoned Anne Boleyn before her, and he survived the abandonment both times. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Agnes Howard, whose negligence in the management of her ward had created the conditions for everything that followed, was released from the Tower in the years following Catherine's death, her life sentence commuted, and her goods eventually restored. She outlived Catherine by more than a decade. Whatever private accounting she may have made of her own role in the destruction of the girl she had been responsible for protecting is something the historical record does not preserve. Jane Boleyn's reputation has undergone significant revision in recent decades. She was for a long time portrayed in historical accounts as a malicious figure who had actively contributed to the deaths of her husband and his sister in 1536, and who had demonstrated in the Catherine Howard affair a pattern of dangerous facilitating behaviour. More recent scholarship has challenged both parts of this portrayal, arguing that the evidence for Jane's active testimony against her husband and Anne in 1536 is considerably weaker than the traditional account assumed, and that her role in Catherine's story was that of a woman caught in circumstances she could not control, making decisions under extreme pressure, and ultimately paying for those decisions with her life. She was buried beside Catherine Howard in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Whatever the full truth of her relationship with the events that destroyed her, she died on the same morning as Catherine, on the same scaffold, and was laid to rest in the same ground. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula stands today within the Tower of London, accessible to visitors who make the journey to the Tower complex. It is a small medieval church of considerable atmospheric density, a place that has served as the burial ground for more significant figures of English history than most people realise until they stand in it and read the floor. Anne Boleyn is there. Catherine Howard is there. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen, who was executed in 1554 at the age of 16. Thomas More and John Fisher, executed for refusing to accept Henry's supremacy over the church. The chapel is, in a very real sense, a monument to the human cost of Tudor power, the place where the machinery of royal ambition deposited its victims, and where the stones of the floor have been accumulating the weight of those names for nearly 5 centuries. Catherine Howard's marker on the floor of that chapel records her name, her identity as the 5th wife of Henry VIII, and the date of her death. It is a small acknowledgement, smaller than she deserved, in a life that was characterized throughout by the smallness of what was provided to her relative to what was demanded of her. But it is there. Her name is there. And that, in a life as abbreviated and as unprotected as hers was, is not nothing. Catherine Howard has not always been treated kindly by the historical tradition that has accumulated around her life and death. For most of the centuries since February of 1542, the dominant image of her has been unflattering in specific and revealing ways. She has been cast as the foolish girl who brought her own destruction upon herself, the minor figure whose lack of political significance and intellectual distinction placed her firmly in the footnote category of Henry VIII's marital history. She was compared, regularly and unfavourably, with the wives who surrounded her. She was not Catherine of Aragon's dignified resistance. She was not Anne Boleyn's political brilliance. She was not Catherine Parr's scholarly accomplishment. She was younger, less educated, less impressive by every measurement that the historical tradition tended to apply, and the story of her life was used primarily as a cautionary tale. Look what happens to girls who are not virtuous, who do not manage themselves correctly, who allow themselves to become entangled in situations that a wiser woman would have avoided. This framing is not simply inadequate, it is actively wrong, and it is wrong in ways that matter, ways that have consequences for how we understand not just Catherine Howard's individual story, but the larger patterns of how power operates on the most vulnerable people in its orbit. The central distortion in the traditional account of Catherine Howard is the treatment of her early life. For most of the time that she has been written about, the relationships she formed with Henry Manox and Frances Dereham in the Duchess's household have been described in language that assigned her equal or greater responsibility for what occurred, that framed her as precocious, as promiscuous, as someone whose early moral failures established a pattern that inevitably culminated in the disaster of her fall. These descriptions were applied to someone who was approximately 12 or 13 years old when the first of those relationships began. They were applied to someone who had no adequate guardian, no protection from the adults around her, no framework that would have allowed her to understand what was being done to her, in terms that would have empowered her to resist it or seek help. Modern historical scholarship, bringing to the documentary record of the 16th century the analytical frameworks of the present day, the understanding of how power operates between adults and children, the recognition of what we now identify as grooming and abuse and exploitation, has reached a very different conclusion about what happened to Catherine Howard in the Duchess's household. Mannix was an adult man in a position of professional authority over a child. Dereham was an older man in a household where Catherine had no genuine protection. The conditions in both cases were conditions in which a young person was exploited by someone with more power, more experience, and significantly less accountability. That Catherine had feelings, genuine feelings in Dereham's case, does not change the fundamental dynamic. Children who are exploited frequently develop genuine feelings for the people who exploit them. This is part of how exploitation works. It does not transform exploitation into mutual choice. Understanding Catherine's early life in these terms requires us to look at everything else she did, including the meetings with Culpeper, including the letter, including the catastrophically bad decision to employ Dereham, through a different lens. These were the actions of a young woman shaped by years of exploitation and neglect, who had never been given the tools to navigate safely through the impossible situation she had been placed in, who was managing a dozen different pressures simultaneously, without adequate support or counsel or any genuine ally who was invested in her survival for reasons beyond their own interests. The recklessness was real. The consequences were real. But the context in which the recklessness occurred, the context of a childhood without adequate protection, an adolescence without genuine guidance, a court placement without real preparation, a marriage to a man 30 years her senior without anyone who truly looked out for her, is inseparable from any honest assessment of what she did and why. The recent scholarship on Catherine Howard has moved in this direction with increasing clarity and commitment. Gareth Russell's biography, Young and Damned and Fair, published in 2017, is the most thorough and the most sympathetically rigorous account of Catherine's life that has yet been written. A book that combines extensive archival research with a genuine commitment to understanding Catherine as a human being, rather than as a symbol or a cautionary tale. Connor Burns' Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's slandered queen, argues explicitly and at length for a more compassionate reading of Catherine's conduct, situating her behaviour within the context of her life in ways that earlier accounts consistently failed to do. These are not sentimental books. They are careful, evidential, historically grounded works of scholarship that simply take the question of context seriously in ways that earlier accounts did not. The reassessments they represent matters not just for Catherine Howard specifically, but for the broader question of how we write history about people who were powerless in relation to the forces that destroyed them. Catherine Howard was not a major political figure. She was not an intellectual, not a reformer, not a woman whose direct agency shaped the course of events in ways that are easily traced in the historical record. She was a girl who was used, who was manipulated, who was abandoned by everyone who had any obligation to her when abandoning her was more convenient than protecting her, and who died on a scaffold at 18 or 19 years old for reasons that had very little to do with justice and very much to do with the needs and the anger of a man whose power was absolute. That she managed, within all of that, to be genuinely warm and genuinely generous and genuinely alive. That the people who knew her at court described her with affection, that she welcomed Anne of Cleves with genuine friendliness, that she gave gifts to young Elizabeth, that she wrote a letter to Culpeper that carries across 500 years the weight of real feeling. This is not irrelevant to how we remember her. It is one of the most important things about her. She was not merely a victim. She was a person, a specific, particular, vivacious and warm and genuinely present person who was in the world for barely 19 years before the world took her out of it, and who left behind the impression of someone who, given the different circumstances, might have been very remarkable indeed. She deserved better than she received. She deserved a guardian who guarded her. She deserved a family that protected her rather than using her. She deserved legal counsel when she was facing accusations that would cost her her life. She deserved to live long enough to discover who she might have become. She received none of these things, and acknowledging that, sitting with the weight of it, refusing to minimize it by distributing blame onto the person who had the least power in every situation she encountered, is the minimum that honest historical remembrance requires. Her grave is in the floor of the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, in the Tower of London. Her name is on the floor beside her cousin Anne Boleyn, the other Howard Queen who died on the same scaffold. They are close together in that chapel, as they were connected in life. Cousins, both caught in the machinery of the same court and the same marriage, both elevated and then destroyed in ways that followed a pattern familiar enough that someone paying attention might have recognized it in time to intervene. Nobody did. The haunted gallery at Hampton Court is still there. Visitors still walk through it. They still tell the story of the sounds in that corridor. The figure in Tudor dress, seen briefly and then gone. The history is there in the stones whether you believe in the ghost or not. A girl ran down that corridor screaming for a door to open. The door stayed shut. 500 years is a long time to wait to be properly understood, but the scholarship is finally doing the work of understanding. And that matters, even now, even after all this time. Of all the artifacts that survive from Catherine Howard's brief and turbulent life, the most remarkable, and in many ways the most moving, is the letter she wrote to Thomas Culpeper. It is the only document that exists in Catherine's own handwriting. Everything else we know about her inner life has come to us filtered through other people's observations, other people's testimony, the records of people who were watching her and reporting on her and judging her. But in this single letter, we have Catherine's own voice, unmediated and unfiltered, expressing something that she felt deeply enough to commit to paper, despite the risk that putting it in writing created. The letter is not elegant. It has the grammar and the spelling of someone who is literate, but not deeply educated in the formal traditions of courtly or scholarly writing. Someone who learned to read and write well enough to function, but who never had the sustained, rigorous educational formation that would have given her more confident command of the written language. It is the letter of someone writing from feeling, rather than from training. Someone whose urgency in communicating what she wants to say is more present than any art in the manner of saying it. She tells Culpeper that her heart longs to be with him. She expresses distress at not being able to see him. She says that she is in pain in his absence. She asks him not to forget her. She sends him tokens of affection. She signs herself his as long as life endures. It is a love letter, or something very close to one. Not the performed love of a court romance, conducted according to the conventions of the game of courtly love. Not the strategic attachment of a woman trying to secure an advantageous relationship. It is something simpler and more vulnerable than either of those things. The genuine expression of a genuine feeling, written in the genuine voice of someone who does not have the trained facility to present feeling with more art than she is using here, who is simply writing what she feels with whatever means of expression she has available. Culpeper kept the letter. This fact alone tells us something about him, that whatever his character's darker dimensions, Whatever the dangers of being in possession of a letter like this, he kept it. He was found with it during the investigation. It was read by Cranmer and by councillors, and eventually, presumably, by the king himself. It became evidence in a legal proceeding that used it to help establish the case for Catherine's treason. The private feelings of a young woman, genuine and entirely personal, were turned into a document of prosecution. Her voice, preserved in ink on paper, was used against her by the very people who were supposed to be administering justice. There is something particularly cruel about this specific aspect of Catherine's story, and it is worth naming directly. The only document in Catherine Howard's own voice that has survived to the present day survives because it was collected as evidence against her, because the people investigating her discovered it, took it, and used it to help justify her execution. Without the investigation, the letter might never have been preserved. Without the investigation, it might have been destroyed by Culpeper himself, as the danger he was in became clear, or it might simply have been lost to time, the way that private correspondence so often is. The survival of the most intimate surviving document of Catherine Howard's inner life is inseparable from the investigation that killed her. And yet the letter survives, and we can read it now. And in reading it, we can hear something that all the rest of the historical record, the ambassadorial dispatches, the legal depositions, the formal records of the court, consistently fails to give us. We can hear Catherine Howard speaking as herself, without performance, without the careful management that queenly life required, without the survival calculation that shaped everything she said in the formal context of her interrogations. We can hear what she sounded like when she was just herself, when the necessity of being the Queen of England had been temporarily suspended, and she was simply a young woman writing to someone she wanted to be with. His little sweet fool, he called her. The phrase is condescending in the way that confident young men's endearments so often are, placing himself above her even in tenderness, positioning himself as the one who sees clearly while she is the one who feels without full understanding. But there is genuine affection in it too, the kind of affection that exists between people who have spent real time together, who have talked and laughed and shared something that meant something to both of them. She was real to him, not merely an attractive queen to be pursued for the status and the thrill of the pursuit. He called her a fool, but he kept her letter, and she signed herself his as long as life endures, which, as it turned out, was not very long at all. The legacy of Catherine Howard is not a legacy of political achievement or intellectual contribution or institutional change. It is not the kind of legacy that history traditionally celebrates, or that fills chapters in books about the great figures of the Tudor age. It is something quieter, and in its own way more fundamental. The legacy of a real person who was in the world for a very short time, who was given very little and from whom very much was taken, and who managed, in the midst of all of that, to be genuinely warm and genuinely present and genuinely herself in ways that people around her noticed, and that the historical record, however partially and however filtered through other people's perspectives, still preserves. She was vivacious. Multiple observers, including people who had no particular reason to be generous to her, used variations of this word to describe her. She was warm. She was generous in the particular way of people who have experienced deprivation and who respond to abundance by wanting to share it. She loved music with a genuine passion, and she danced with genuine pleasure, and she laughed easily, and she greeted people with a warmth that read as real because it was real. She welcomed Anne of Cleves at the Christmas court with a friendliness that, given the circumstances, required a genuine generosity of spirit, rather than merely a performance of it. She gave gifts to young Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, the child who would grow up to be England's greatest queen. and those gifts were given with the open hand of someone who found pleasure in giving. She ran down a corridor screaming for help. She practiced laying her head on a block. She walked to the scaffold with composure and made her speech without collapsing. She was young enough that these things happened within the span of approximately 2.5 years, from the first Christmas at Hampton Court to the morning on Tower Green. She was younger than the gap between those events suggests, because the density of experience packed into those years would have aged anyone. She was buried beside Anne Boleyn in the chapel of a fortress, without ceremony, on a cold February day in 1542. She's been there for nearly 500 years. The city has grown enormously around the tower in those centuries. The Thames still flows past its walls. The stones of the chapel floor still carry the names of the people laid beneath them. Catherine Howard, 5th Queen of Henry VIII, died the 13th of February, 1542. She was real. She was here. She is still worth remembering clearly and carefully for exactly who she was. And so, dear sleepy listener, we come gently to the end of our long, peaceful journey through the life of Catherine Howard, the teenage queen whose story has moved and troubled and demanded honest reckoning for nearly 500 years. Tonight, we travel together from the shadowed rooms of a neglected childhood in a crowded Tudor household, through the lax and dangerous world of the Duchess's household, where a child was left without adequate protection, through the extraordinary and terrifying experience of becoming the most celebrated and the most vulnerable woman in England, through the secret letter and the stolen meetings and the desperate run down a moonlit palace corridor, through the long, cold winter at Sion House and the February morning at the Tower, when a girl barely 19 years old laid her head upon a block and left this world with more dignity than the world had ever shown to her. Catherine Howard was real. She was not a symbol or a cautionary tale or a footnote in someone else's more important story. She was a young woman who loved music and dancing, who welcomed her predecessor with genuine warmth at a Christmas court, who wrote a letter full of real feeling that survived 500 years because it was taken from her as evidence. She ran down a corridor screaming. She walked to the scaffold steadily. She was young enough to have been someone's child, and old enough to have been someone's queen, and she deserved to have been protected with the seriousness that both of those things required. She deserved better than she received, and remembering her truly, carefully, with the full weight of what her story asks of us, is the most honest thing we can offer across the enormous distance of all these centuries. If tonight's journey has moved you, please take just a moment before you drift away to leave a gentle comment below. Tell us which part of Catherine's story stayed with you. We would love to hear from you, and so would the rest of our community of dreamers here at Sleepy Crown. If you have not yet subscribed, please do. It keeps these peaceful histories finding their way to the listeners who need them. Now let everything soften. Let the Tudor world dissolve into the warmth of wherever you are. Let the stone corridors and the river sounds and the torchlight grow dim and distant, until only the sound of your own breathing remains, slow and steady and deep. You are safe. You are warm. You are here. Catherine Howard lived nearly 500 years ago. She danced and laughed and loved and suffered and endured. Tonight, because you listened, she was remembered. Sleep well, dear listener. From all of us at Sleepy Crown, good night.